Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Myrrh Bearing Millennial Podcast, where I help millennial moms feel fulfilled in motherhood by sharing biblical femininity tips and traditional values, and so much more. Before we dive into today's episode, if you wouldn't mind, if you end up loving what you hear today, if you've loved what you've heard over the past few weeks, if you could please go ahead and rate the episode, share it with your friends to help the podcast get discovered. I would appreciate that so much. On today's episode, we've got another awesome guest lined up for you today, sharing her conversion story from a traumatic Mormon past and through so many different experiences with different religions. All of this has brought her to Orthodoxy, where she has found such peace and truth and love and grace, where she is now sharing mental health support and resources for Orthodox Christian women and Christian women alike. So join me in today's episode, and thank you for listening to another episode of the Myrrh Bearing Millennial Podcast. Let's dive into the interview. All right, hello and welcome to the Myrrh Bearing Millennial Podcast. I am so excited because I have a new friend of mine that I have met through Instagram. Her name is Mila Hix, and her Instagram handle is Ascetic Femininity. And I have learned so much from her Instagram and the stuff that she posts. And I've learned so much more about Orthodoxy in general, too, just from following her content. So I'm really excited to have her here. We're going to be talking about mental health and healing mental health within women, and how that relates with Orthodoxy and religion and so forth. And so I'm really excited to have you here. Hi, Mila. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. So tell us about yourself and like who you are, what you do, all the things.
Well, I've been joking lately that I am a well-kept housewife.
Yes.
That's basically what I do. I am a mom of 6. I have 4 of my own children, and then I have 2 stepchildren. We're a blended family, and so I kind of do all of the juggling related to blended families. But we are in Utah, and so we're part of the Orthodox community in the state of Utah. And I am a former teacher, and I'm also a former Mormon. I know that question is going to come up later where I talk more about that. But yeah, it just I just live life and try and be good at the things God wants me to be good at.
That's awesome. I actually heard there's a friend of mine who uses the term, she's a domestic engineer. And I loved that. And so that's how I think of like us housewives or homemakers. We are domestic engineers or CEOs of our home. So awesome. Sure. So cool. Curious, just off the top of my head, how big is the Orthodox community pretty big in Utah?
Surprisingly it is. We have 2 Antiochian parishes, we have 3 Greek parishes, we have a Russian parish, we have a Serbian parish. Oh, I'm sorry, no, we have 3 Antiochian parishes.
Wow.
And then I apologize, we have 4 Greek parishes. And there's, a pretty big collection of them in Salt Lake County, so more northern Utah. And I think there might even actually be a Coptic Orthodox parish up there too. I'm not super familiar with them, but we have really close relationships with Father Nikifor of the Serbian parish and Father Michael at the Russian parish. But I attend St. Peter and Paul with Father Paul Trubenbach. You may have seen him on YouTube, and he is as wonderful. He is as wonderful as he seems. He's my husband's godfather, and he just is really a wonderful person. And any of the things that I know about mental health have been corroborated, I guess would be the right word, by Father Paul. He has a background in mental health counseling, and he and I have sat around and kind of talked shop a few times, and I've run sort of the impressions and the hunches that I've had about mental illness and how to heal that through him, and he is like, yeah, you nailed it. And so I try and always sort of run things through him before I just start like spewing things on Instagram that aren't true, right? I don't want to
That's
be
amazing.
heretical.
No, that's
So,
amazing.
yeah, lots and lots of Orthodox parishes out here by comparison to like Idaho or Nevada or Arizona has a few. I think Arizona has a few Orthodox parishes out there. There's not very many in Florida. I'm originally from Florida. I'm a Florida girl at heart, but it's it's just really interesting to see that in the capital of Mormonism, we're
Right.
seeing we're seeing authentic Christianity flourish.
That's incredible. Oh my gosh. I love hearing that, and I didn't know that. And so I'm excited to tell my husband too, because we've traveled to Salt Lake before.
Hmm.
And so we've seen the Mormon temple and everything. And I had no idea that Orthodoxy was as big there as it is. And so that's wonderful. Okay, so with Orthodoxy then, were you born Orthodoxy? Did you convert? Like I know the answer because you had mentioned that you used to be Mormon. So are you open to sharing your story about this?
Yeah, totally. I'll try and condense it down because people who follow me on Instagram know that I turn short stories into long ones because I think that the details matter when they really don't. So
Same here.
I'll try and cut that down a little bit. Also, there's something to be said about me enjoying the sound of my own voice. So yeah, I was born and raised Mormon, and the mainstream sect because there's so many different sects of Mormonism. You have fundamentalist Mormons that are still practicing polygamy, and even those polygamist branches of Mormonism have their own branches. There are so many different flavors of Mormonism, but I was born and raised into the corporate version of Mormonism. They like to call
Okay.
themselves the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Yep.
And so I'm what they call pioneer stock, coming from pioneer stock. I have ancestors that built the Mormon church. And so
Oh,
it was very deeply ingrained into me. And it was right around 2014 when the Mormon Church came out with articles about the the accurate historical version of how Joseph Smith actually translated. And for people who are listening, I'm air quoting translated the Book of Mormon. What I was taught in primary as a child did not match what this new article had stated. What I was taught in primary is that when Joseph Smith uncovered the Book of Mormon, also known as the brass plates in the Hill Cumorah, he rolled the stone away and then he found a breastplate that had a Urim and a Thummim, or two seer stones attached to them. And that's what he looked through to translate the characters on these brass plates. And then in 2014, this article came out and they said, actually, that's not how it happened. We've been teaching these primary kids incorrectly this entire time. What he really did is he was a well digger and he had taken a stone out of the well, decided that he really liked it. So it was his precious. And he put it inside of a hat and he looked in the hat at this rock and then just started saying words to come out of the that were supposed to be translating the book. He never had the plates in front of him for the translation process, and no one else was allowed to look at them. And so something deep inside of me broke because I knew that this was true and that this was the beginning of uncovering lies upon lies upon lies. And um, I laugh about it now, but it was really traumatic for me. It was really traumatic for me. I was raised in a household that was pretty abusive. My dad was very physically abusive, emotionally abusive, and even sexually abusive. And the only thing that I had to hang on to and to rely on was my faith in Mormonism. And so, as a mom of two, I had a little boy who was 2 years old, and then I had a baby, my first daughter, as a mom of two. And kind of coming upon this information, it broke me apart. It absolutely broke me apart. I had nothing to rely on anymore. I had nothing to believe in anymore. It was like the one thing, the one true north in my life was Mormonism, right? And then that was pulled out from under me too. And so I went on this really awful journey trying to find and make sense of meaning in my life, because I knew that there was a God. I've never been interested in atheism. I've had way too many personal experiences spiritually, trying to seek God, trying to hear his voice, trying to do what he wants me to do, being that I became more and more concerned about being a good Christian more than being a good Mormon, and caring about policies and procedures and, the corporate, the corporate framework of mainstream Mormonism. And I just became less and less concerned with that. And it led me out. It led me out. And I ended up holding on to more of deeper doctrine, deeper Mormon cosmology that I vibed with, I guess, that was so incredibly heretical that it actually led me into paganism. And so I ended up practicing witchcraft for a while, and that didn't end up so good. That was also really, really traumatic. And I'm still kind of dealing with the consequences of those sins. And from there, I ended up getting really, really sick during my third pregnancy. And I used to have this ability to discern what was wrong with me and be able to help myself. And during this pregnancy, I completely lost that ability. I became filled with confusion and fear, and I didn't know what was truth and what was not truth. It was just in this state of awful, hellish limbo. And so I didn't know where else to turn. And so I started at ground zero with, okay, what's familiar to me? We'll just start with that, and then we'll use that as a foundation, and then we'll rebuild my life from scratch from there. Because the alternative at that point, I was having suicidal ideation. I wanted to have an abortion, like just really awful, rock bottom, dark stuff. And so I went back to Mormonism because it was familiar and I didn't know where else to go. But I still couldn't get over Joseph Smith lying, and the Mormon church hiding how Joseph documented how this quote unquote translation took place. I could never get that out of my head. And so it was always on the back burner on a shelf. And I thought, there's about Mormonism. I'm going to stick around and see if I can climb the ranks and incite change. The best way to change things is from the inside, not necessarily leaving and holding your sign protesting at events and whatnot. I've never really been attracted to the angry side of being an ex-Mormon. And so I doubled down, I doubled down really hard. I ended up becoming a temple worker, like an ordinance worker, just to sort of rectify and justify and fight that doubt that I had, doubling down to eliminate, I'm going to be super hardcore Mormon,
Yeah.
And ended up bringing me closer to God, trying so hard to find him, just keep finding him, just keep finding him. And it was such a cognitive dissonance that the closer and the harder I tried to hear God's voice, the further away it brought me from Mormonism. When you're told and inoculated from the time that you're young that seeking God brings you closer to Mormonism, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I really struggled with that. And then something happened with one of my bishops out here in Utah. It was actually on my birthday about 3 or 4 years ago. And it may have been about 3 years ago, Orthodoxy, to be honest. And I sat down, we had a car that needed repairs and it couldn't be left in the parking spot at our apartment complex. Otherwise, it would be towed after a certain amount of time, which is common practice for a lot of apartment complexes. But we had only one covered parking space and we couldn't put our car in that covered parking space because it's not running, right?
Right.
And so I went to the bishop for financial help. And this was right around the time when the Mormon church, released their financial statement of having $100 billion in excess funds. And yeah, everyone who does anything, it's all self-powered. Like they're taking 10% of everyone's money and they're not paying bishops. They're not paying anyone who teaches anything. They're not paying for trainings. They're not paying for, all tithing dollars are used like in a vacuum and no one's bringing, yeah. So there's very little output. It's all just coming in. And there's a lot of wealthy people in the world who have been attracted to Mormonism because it is the wealthiest church in the United States. Because of that $100 billion in excess funds. So that's why they're building all these temples. They're trying to avoid being taxed on their excess funds. And so they're just like building temples anywhere that they can, regardless of if the people need them or want them, or if there's even a demographic for it. They're just trying to get rid of this money so they can't be taxed on it. And then I always forget, like I go on tangents and then I forget what my point is.
Something had happened with your bishop and
yes, something did happen with my bishop. So I came to him and I asked for help. I was like, we need help repairing our van, our family vehicle, because we had 3 kids at the time. No, I'm sorry, we had 4 kids at the time, my ex-husband and I. And he said, well, let's do a needs assessment form where someone I didn't know and had never met was supposed to come into my home, sit down at the table with me, look at my bank account information, and tell me where I'm overspending. We were living in government subsidized housing. My ex-husband was making $45,000 a year, rent in Utah, with the subsidized apartment we were in based on our taxable income. We were still paying $1,300 for rent.
Oh my gosh.
And so that's cheap to a lot of people now. And it was like a 1,600 square foot apartment. It was like 4 bedrooms and 2 bathrooms. So it was an okay sized apartment, but it was on the 3rd floor. And so we had a lot of stairs to climb. And I got really upset with this bishop. I'm like, I'm not comfortable. I'm not comfortable having this person come in because I didn't know him. I had never met him. And I was really like protective about our financial situation. I was like, is it not enough that I stay at home and I don't go anywhere and I already don't have a car and I'm feeding my children, I'm making food from scratch so that I'm not spending extra money on like luxury. Like I'm doing everything that I can. And that's like, we don't have cable. We don't have any debt that we're paying off. And we just need help repairing this van. And so I was like, I'm just not comfortable. Like, well, I'm offering you this help. And your response is a total slap in the face. And I have never been spoken to like that by any Mormon bishop. And anyone who is Mormon listening to this, that's not standard practice for Mormon bishops. Every Mormon bishop that I have sat with has actually been incredibly loving and has given me pretty good advice in the past. Responding to familial problems with love and not with anger. That's a very Christian thing. And so this bishop totally threw me under the bus. And it was such a huge turnoff. We'd been mistreated by this ward the entire time. We were basically invisible because I wasn't bleach blonde and super skinny and taking Adderall to suppress my appetite And because I didn't have Botox and lip filler and
Oh,
have a perfect house and, any of that, it's like I totally blended into the woodwork and we were essentially ignored. And so this new bishop comes in and he's like, well, I'm still new. And I'm like, listen, I've had a lot of new bishops and none of them have spoken to me like this. And so I filed a complaint with the stake president and it just rubbed me the wrong way. And then COVID happened.
mm,
And then some of the things that the president of the Mormon Corporation was doing, I did not agree with. I'm extremely traditional. I'm going to be very upfront and say I don't believe in the vaccine. I
neither do
don't
I.
believe in
You're
masks.
good.
I don't believe in wearing the mask.
Nope.
He's rubbing shoulders with China. Like he speaks Chinese and is known as a friend of China. He's rubbing shoulders with racist organizations. I wish I could remember the acronym for them. And they are they're taking church money and funding the production of vaccines that are being given to people overseas, especially in Africa, thinking that they're doing a good thing. I'm like, this man's a heart surgeon. Why is he doing this? Like, he should know that it's at least 2 years before the FDA should be approving any vaccine given. And they're just whipping out a vaccine in 3 months. Heck no. Why is he not seeing what's really happening? And instead, I ended up being in the ward of the man who runs public relations for the Mormon church. And so my ward was like the poster child for the rest of the LDS church, like community, worldwide, global. It was my ward being photographed in sacrament meeting wearing masks. It was my ward, having quotes taken and, all this other stuff. And I just couldn't believe it. And so I was like, something is really, really wrong. And I can't ignore this. I can't ignore anymore. I can ignore and try and forget about, the whole Joseph Smith translation thing. But this is here and now. And I don't want to put my trust in someone who is not putting his trust in God, because they are encouraging us to be sheep and comply with unconstitutional government standards and buying into the whole fear mongering. And I'm like, if this is the church, if this is Christ's church, why are we buying into this? Like, why? And so I started going down a rabbit hole again and sort of like, yeah.
Oh my gosh.
And just like researching all these things about, sexual allegations with bishops and mission presidents and, remembering my own experiences with being molested and the bishop doing nothing about it. And I was just like, nope. This is what I needed to go. This is what I needed to leave, because now it's no longer safe for me to be there. It was a matter of like my safety, because I'm not going to brainwash myself into believing something that I know isn't true anymore. And during COVID, I have started to really kind of establish like an Instagram sort of, not the aesthetic femininity Instagram. This was like 3 years ago. I had a different handle. And I was really involved with the trad community, the very traditional living community.
Yeah.
Women belong in the kitchen. They belong with their babies. Men are the protectors and the providers. Marriage is ordained by God. All the traditional values. And so I kind of established this community and had been part of this community for a little while where there was a lot of Orthodox stuff coming onto my feed. And prior to COVID, I had established an interest in the great books and classical literature. So Hellenistic literature like the Odyssey of Homer and the Iliad, and Hellenistic philosophy, Socrates, Plato, all this other stuff. Things that had been an interest of mine since I was a child. I was really into Greek mythology. And so because I was in this trad community and also in the classical, we'll call it the classical education community, I was seeing a lot of overlap with Orthodox social media influencers or profiles or whatever, what have you. One of them being Dr. Stephen Turley. He's got a
Mhm.
YouTube channel. He's like a political commentator. He's like a really solid guy. And then a lot of like homeschooling curriculum sites that I really, really liked because they were focused on classical education also happened to be Orthodox homeschooling curriculum.
Yeah.
And so I'm thinking like there's something here. And so I started investigating it a little bit and I emailed a couple of priests in my area. Father Patrick O'Rourke, who is now at Holy Cross Seminary. He was an assistant priest at Holy Trinity Cathedral in downtown
Mhm.
Salt Lake City. Sent him an email, and then I sent Father Justin Havens an email. And Father Patrick got back to me right away, and we scheduled an appointment to talk. And we talked for like 2 hours, and I had like several bullet points that I needed to address because I was not one of those Mormons that was ignorant. I
Mhm.
actually knew the doctrine extremely well. And so there were some key points of Mormonism that I needed him to rebut for me to have the courage to even take a step into an Orthodox church. And he did it beautifully. He did such a great job. I had chills. And I remember at the end of this 2 hours, I asked Father Patrick, well, now what do I do?
And what did he
What
say?
do I? He's like, well, take a deep breath and say, Lord, have mercy.
Oh, yep. Oh my gosh, that's
And
amazing.
yeah, and then being, just a baby, I was like, well, what's that?
Right.
So I had to learn everything all over again. Thinking that Mormonism and Orthodox Christianity has any similarity. There are some things that are similar, but it's not the same. I
Right.
mean, there are some complementary teachings, but it's not the same. I thought I was being handed a new map that had the same landmarks but had different directions. But in
Mhm.
reality, I was being handed a new map entirely. None of the landmarks were there. None of the directions were the same. Like learning how to pray was
Mhm.
totally different how to pray, and which is a fundamental Christian principle of how to pray. Um, and then, like Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and the fall, that doctrine,
Mhm.
fundamentally different, fundamentally different.
What?
Jesus is fundamentally different too. Jesus in Mormonism had a secret wife, and in
I did not know
yeah,
this.
yep. And then there's a heavenly mother and a heavenly father who has a body in Mormonism. It's a very anthropomorphized version of Christianity. And starting my catechism in Orthodoxy, where Father Paul addresses the unoriginate Father who has no beginning and who has no end, actually was immensely healing for me.
Mm.
It I'm a crier. I'm totally gonna cry. But in Mormonism, there's this, you know, as man is, God once was kind of I don't remember who said that. I wish I could remember who's quoted in saying that. But it's like that's saying that God had a beginning.
Yeah.
And that was so unnerving to me. And
Mm.
it's like, well, if God had a beginning, then who was God before him? And
Right.
then before him, and then before, like, how? It's like one of those like serious, disturbing questions that people ponder,
Right.
trying to make sense of it with some form of mental real estate that they have to try and comprehend that. But the fact that God is unoriginate, has no beginning, has no end, existed,
Mm.
has has no body, and so therefore it's not all about me and my body,
Right.
was just so immensely peaceful.
I love
So
that.
that is essentially how I stumbled into Orthodoxy. I knew where to go, and all of my questions were answered. And I'm like, I'm not going to mess around with Roman Catholicism. I'm not going to mess around with any Protestantism. If I'm going to do this, if I'm going to be Christian, I'm going to find it. I'm going to
Mm.
find Christ. And I did.
That is amazing. An incredible conversion story, and the amount of like spiritual growth that you went through and then coming and finding orthodoxy through that. That's incredible. And I'm sorry for everything that you went through traumatically as well through Mormonism and paganism and witchcraft and so forth. So I'm sorry for everything that you went through. So I guess, I mean, I'm not going to assume anything, but I know you mentioned trauma and stuff, but what sparked then your passion to provide mental health support for Orthodox Christian women?
Um, so I targeted Orthodox Christian women in general, because we're kind of on the same plane. Like we kind of have the same mindset.
Hmm.
And the the offering that I have, the offering that really works, is understood by Orthodox Christian women. If I tried to say to an atheist woman, you'd be so much happier if you just repent, that's not going to
She'd
go
look at
very,
you like you had 10 heads.
yeah, that's not going to go very good for either one of us. But if an Orthodox Christian woman is so much more receptive to that, it's just I don't know any other way to offer a resource of healing that's secularized. The person that has come the closest that I have kind of seen and established um, still has some things that are not, that don't quite jive, that don't quite get to the root of the issue. I'm all about finding the root of the issue and then all the other issues going away. And so for me, it was just about, hey, I have found an immense resource of healing. It's possible that other women don't know about this.
That's amazing. I love that. So then what are some controversies that you may have seen or heard or experienced with mental health and Christian women? I mean, I know I actually have a background of being a trauma counselor. So I was a victims advocate for 2 years, and I worked with victims of domestic violence and sexual assault. And so I was a trauma counselor before this was long before my husband ever found orthodoxy and brought me into it. And so I never had the religious aspect of trauma counseling. But what are some controversies that you may have seen or something or surrounding Christian women and their mental health?
That it's their fault.
Mm.
There's a lot of there's a lot of, well, I think in general, when we're talking about healing mental illness outside of the realm of medication and traditional talk therapy, there's going to be a lot of controversy. And
Yeah.
there's even added controversy, even suggesting that it's a spiritual malady, right? But there's a lot, especially women, because we're really internal, and we also like to blame ourselves for the things that are going wrong in our lives. And like, why am I like this? Why can't I just be like, whatever? We have this sense of comparing ourselves to other people, especially other women who seem like they've got it all together. But that would probably be the biggest controversy that I've seen, is that women think it's their fault. They think they just take the blame for everything, and they think that it's their fault. And then they start to identify themselves with their thoughts that they're having. And then it just kind of makes it worse and deeper and deeper and deeper. And another controversy that I've come across, I actually really appreciated this question because it made me ponder quite a bit. Another controversy that I've seen is that, mental illness has a cause. Ever since that new study came out that said that depression is not caused by chemical imbalances, I was sitting there like, it's about time somebody finally came out and said this.
Right.
But this is new. This is news to a lot of people, and so that's extremely controversial too, because then it begs the question: well, what is the cause of depression, right? And so, I love Instagram for certain things. I came across a post, and I wish I could remember who posted it, but a book was referenced in this quote. It wasn't the quote itself that caught my attention, but it was the book that was referenced on this quote, and it was called Conquering Depression.
Hmm.
And I immediately called Father Paul and I said, do you know how I can get my hands on a copy of Conquering Depression? Because it's out of print. Because he's the priest to call when books are out of print. And he's like, oh, I have a copy. And I'm like, oh, of course you do. And so I actually have it right here. And I haven't been able to get through it because it's just so rich.
Mm.
But it talks a lot about what depression is, how to treat it. Looks like this. I don't know if people are gonna. Well, it's a
Is that an
podcast.
Orthodox book?
It is an Orthodox book. It was published by St. Herman of Alaska Brotherhood,
Oh, that's amazing.
and it is out of print, unfortunately. So we're gonna try and fix that. Sister, let's see, Saint Maria the New Martyr. She is known as the consoler of those who are depressed, and she had Parkinson's disease that left her bedridden, and she couldn't even move her mouth, and she could barely open her eyes. So she was bedridden, and people would come to her and tell them all of their problems, and they would leave, and their depression would lift. And so that was her gift from God, was to be able to console people in their sorrow. And so this is what she says to the writer of this book when he went to visit her. She says that depression is a spiritual cross. It's sent to help the penitent who does not know how to repent.
Hmm.
And so I just let that sink in and thought about that more. And she continues on with this other thing, more of it, but it's essentially depression is caused by a lack of repentance.
Yeah.
And I know anecdotally in my own life, that's 100% true for me in my life. I find that I feel more light coming in when I say evening prayers as opposed to when I say morning prayers. And evening prayers are all about, please forgive me, please forgive this, please forgive this, please forgive this. It's all about the repenting of the day. And so I would say that that's extremely controversial. I wrote a paper about this when I was in university, and my English teacher didn't like it. She's like,
What?
you didn't rebut yourself saying that it could actually be a chemical balance. And I was like, well, I did include that in the paper, but you're focusing on me not giving it half of the paper.
Right.
So she got offended by it. So I didn't get the grade that I deserved on it.
I've never thought about it that way. Well, first of all, I'm sorry that professor did that to you. But like that, because I've always been told like it's a chemical imbalance. Like myself, I have postpartum depression really bad. And so like I'm on Prozac to help treat it. And I had, some mental health conversations with my priest. We recently went through a miscarriage in September. And it took my mental health for a spiral. And like I had many, many conversations with our priest because I was so angry with God. I was so mad at him. And didn't know that I could, like, if I could trust my body or anything like that. And interesting, he was like, our spiritual life and our mental health, they're almost one and the same, right? Because the moment something is going on mentally, like Satan is trying to get in there in any way, shape, or form that he can. And so, the depression that I was feeling, the cycle that I was going down after the miscarriage, like he knew I was vulnerable. So the demons are just going to come after it and use that. And we see that so much in society with mental health disorders. And it really is just like what I ended up having to do. And granted, it's still painful, but like my priest said, God is our father. And he's like, you get mad at your parents. And I said, yeah. And he goes, well, then you can get mad at God. That's fine. You just can't turn away from him. So I did. I like had it out. Like I was home alone and I was just yelling. I was like, why did you do this? Like, I'm mad. Of course, even if I ever got the answer as to why it happened, it still wouldn't bring peace. But I like disagreement and a pretty big fight with him over it. And then I just prayed and just said all of these prayers, and my husband and I did, and we visited a monastery and everything. And that brought so much peace into all of that. So I totally see what you're saying. And now I wish I just looked it up on Amazon. There's one copy of that book left.
It's like $125.
$125.
Yes.
I can't spend that on a book.
No. So I'll have to talk to Father Paul and see how we can try and mass produce this at some point. I don't know. We'll have to go through the Brotherhood. But yeah, and postpartum depression, I feel, is a different creature because we're talking about hormones. We've been attached to the placenta that's producing progesterone for us, and that's why we feel energized in the second trimester, and why we feel that bond to the baby as soon as it's born. And once that progesterone rich placenta is gone, you're not producing progesterone again until you next ovulate, because
which could be forever.
Which could be forever if you're breastfeeding and that stops you from ovulating, so that's, your body is like in flux with those hormones. And so there's also something to be said about like having a really supportive community. I am so grateful for Orthodoxy because we have those 40 days after we have a baby, to bond with our baby, to kind of establish a new normal with our family. We have extremely loving parishioners that come in and take care of us. We have prayers that are said over us. Because my last baby was really traumatic too. I don't get postpartum depression, but I get insane postpartum anxiety to where I feel like I'm gonna die. Like me and my baby are dying.
I'm so sorry.
And so it's really rough. It's super hard. And I've always thought I was being heretical when I say it's okay to get angry at God because he can handle it. But I'm really glad that your priest was able to give that advice to you, because probably the most effective prayer that I had as a Mormon was when I was just cussing. I got rid of the dear Heavenly Fathers and the these and the thous and the thou art, and I didn't thank him for anything. I was like, this freaking sucks. And if you don't do, like, I was a demanding brat. Like, this really sucks. My life is hell. And if you don't do something about this, I'm done. Like, I'm gonna end up taking my own life, because I was living every day with PTSD triggers, living in an emotionally abusive marriage, and then being a part of a really mentally toxic religious community or cult, whatever you want to call it. And so I was not in a good place. And so I finally just threw Mormon prayer out the door, and I just talked to him, and I could feel that burden lift. And so sometimes anger and just being real with God, he can handle it.
That's what he's there for. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Okay, so I recently read a post on you have another account called Think Pretty Thoughts, right? Yeah. So I read a post on it that said, it stated, contrary to popular belief, you don't deserve to be happy. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah. I figured that would get people's attention.
It got mine.
I think as a society, we're addicted to happiness.
Yeah.
We feel like we're supposed to be happy all the time. And the reality is that happiness is extremely superficial, because what makes me happy doesn't make the other person happy. It's very subjective, And I saw this t-shirt at Walmart that said, "You deserve to be happy" on it. And immediately I started having these prideful thoughts of like how my life should be better than it really is. And how, why am I not happy? Do I, is God somehow like not bestowing his happiness upon me? And then I immediately identified that thought as not the truth.
Right.
And so I thought, you know what? I deserve damnation in hell. That's what I deserve. I am a sinner. I am the worst sinner. And I deserve damnation and hell. And Christ loves me so much that he saved me if I say I'm sorry for all the terrible things that I've done and like truly repent for those things. And what gives me more comfort to say that I deserve to be happy or that I deserve hell and damnation? And I have a loving God who gives me the opportunity and the ability to not have that be my fate. Like that gives me more peace, that gives me more joy, that gives me more spiritual refreshment than thinking I'm entitled to be happy. Well, no, I'm not.
Okay, our listeners can't see me right now, but I'm tearing up. Wow, that was I've never heard it that way, but the way you just explained that was like the purest form of grace we could ever truly feel from God. Is just how much he loves us is because you're right. Like we are all sinners. I've done some pretty terrible things in my life. And I mean, I've never admitted it except for just admitting all my wrongs in my life confession and so forth. I never thought about it that way. But yeah, like I do deserve to go to hell. And it is so much comfort and protection and just grace, realizing and knowing that that's not what God wants for us, though. He wants us. He wants to protect us. He wants to bring us home to him. And so, oh my gosh, you have me in tears. Whew. Okay, so what are some steps that women can take to begin healing and supporting their mental health?
Oh goodness. Well, the first step would be to watch your thoughts. Watch what's going into your thoughts. And also be really careful about what you're feeding yourself, like visually, audio, because once it gets in there, it's really like it just floats around. It's really difficult to get it back out. You have to train yourself to just stop thinking about that. I watched Silence with the Lambs with my husband probably 2 or 3 months ago, and there's still a line in that movie that I cannot get out of my head, and that is a terrible movie. It's a terrible movie.
My husband put it away, like, you know, how our Orthodox icons are supposed to be windows into heaven. He was like, maybe the TV is like a window to hell because all the terrible stuff on TV and everything. Like, I was watching the show Supernatural, and when they brought God into the picture in the show and all this stuff, like, my husband would hear it in the background. He's like, I don't think I like this in our house. And then as it got further, I was like, I'm not comfortable watching this anymore. Yeah, no, you're totally right. Okay, keep going. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
And there's like a part of me that almost tries to push the limit with what I can tolerate, but that's not my job. That's not my sensibility as a woman who's trying to step into my femininity more. Mother of God would never flirt with that line. And so why do I? You know, it's like, oh, well, how much can I tolerate? You know? The answer is if you're trying to protect your mental health, 0. You should tolerate 0. Because, and especially if you've got trauma, if you've got if you've been struggling with anxiety or depression for a long time, it's really important to protect yourself with those images and the words and situations and things like that, both in music and in YouTube videos and movies and Netflix and blah blah blah. Because nothing is safe anymore. Nothing is safe anymore.
No, I mean, there's even, you know, there's we've praised Orthodoxy in this entire episode, but there's Orthodox accounts and stuff that are not true Orthodox accounts that aren't right. So
yeah,
nothing. I mean, nothing is perfect. Nothing is pure, except God.
yeah.
So are there any projects you're working on or any announcements that you have for our listeners?
Well, I have a couple of resources for women who are struggling with mental health, and it's sort of like a cognitive behavioral therapy training exercise journal workbook type situation. And
Okay,
it's called
love it.
Think Pretty. It's called Think Pretty. And this was the first edition. I've updated it since. But it's a journal that has prompts. I call the upward spiral. And you're supposed to answer, you know, the prompt in order. Because as someone who has PTSD, I get triggered almost on a daily basis, and I've come a really long way. I still have a lot of healing to do. It's going to be a lifelong process for me. And so I got triggered this one time, and I knew immediately that I needed to go and just journal and journal and journal and make sense of the thoughts in my head and identify which were not true and how to replace that untruth with truth. Because it's all about rewiring your brain and acknowledging that's not a true thought, and then putting truth there rather than just dismissing. So we can dismiss an untrue thought, but the healing really comes is when we put truth back in its place. And so I would ask myself these questions, what feeling am I feeling? Am I feeling angry? Am I feeling sad? Am I feeling anxious? And then I'd ask myself, what was I thinking about or doing before I started feeling angry? And I write that down. Are any of these thoughts true or helpful? Because I don't necessarily want to, sugarcoat everything and bright side it all. It's like, if it's a true thought, like, wow, that's super prideful of me to think this. That's true, but it doesn't always feel good. And then I identify which of these thoughts really belong to me. Because I feel like when we start thinking, when we go in that downward spiral, that's why I call this the upward spiral. When we start going into that downward spiral, we start to sort of like identify ourselves with the negative thoughts, the bad demonic thoughts that we have, the untrue thoughts. Like, no, that's not part of my identity.
Right.
And so it's really important to identify that those thoughts are not you. They don't belong to you. And I feel like we would have far fewer homosexual individuals coming out. We would have fewer transgender people. We'd have fewer people who think that they're, a tabby cat, identifying as a different species than they really are. It's like, that's not a true thought. I don't have to identify with that thought. That isn't me. That's not me that's thinking that. And then the last question on the upward spiral would be, what truth can I replace those thoughts with? And in the back of this, I have like an appendix of truths of if people can't find the truth to put in that place, they can always run to the back of this book and put a truth from the back of this book in place. So one of the biggest truths back here is like, dwelling on my trauma does not heal me. It makes me neurotic and self-obsessed. That's the first one. And then there's scriptures back here, truth from the word. For God hath not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. It's telling us right there in scripture that God didn't make us this way. He gave us a mind that is not full of fear. He gave us a spirit of power and full of love. And he gave us a sound mind, not a mind that's full of craziness. Like, my husband only married me because I was really cute, because we all have that thought. All of us married women have that thought at one point in our marriage. My husband only married me because I was really cute and I'm not cute anymore. Maybe he doesn't love me anymore. And it's like, stop.
Oh, yeah.
That doesn't belong to you. So that's one resource. And then the other one is a gratitude sketchbook. So when we're dwelling on our grateful thoughts and we're on our knees in gratitude to God, that is what lets light in. That's where we want our thoughts to always be. And so once again, this is a sketchbook that has prompts where you can either sketch or hand letter the answer to the prompt. The first one is someone you love. So I have the choice of drawing Zosima, my husband. I have a choice of drawing his face, which he'd be really upset about, or hand lettering his name. And so that's another project that I'm working on that has not yet been released. Both of these ones that I just mentioned, the sketchbook and the journal, are both already available on Amazon.
It is on Amazon because I was just looking for it.
Yes, it is on Amazon. Hix, M.Hix, I think is who I have it authored by.
Okay, I'm gonna have you send the link so that way we can attach it to the episode.
Yes, for sure. And then I'm also currently working on a book. Oh, I'm sorry. I also have a coloring book, a Think Pretty coloring book, where you're coloring beautiful pictures. Because when we can turn off voices, like it's a tool to help you turn off the voices in your head. When you're in the present moment, pen to
Yeah.
paper, everything else goes away.
Mm.
And so I've got a coloring book, and I'm currently working on a hand lettering practice guide that has Psalms, that has prayers, that has the creed. That's how I learned the creed. I memorized it by doing it in calligraphy.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, that's
And so
awesome.
it's very zen to be able to do that. It's very slow. You're right there in the present moment, absorbing God's word. And so I have that in the works. That is taking much longer than I thought it would. Um, but those are the projects for the foreseeable future. I am considering doing like a homemaking housewife log book where you're
Yeah.
just simply writing down what you did accomplish in that day, not what you didn't. So
Mm.
that you're focusing on this is what I've done, not beating yourself up on what you didn't.
That's phenomenal. I love that you have these resources available. This is truly amazing, Mila, and I can't thank you enough for everything that you have shared, and just you've poured so much wisdom and value and love and stuff into this conversation. And so I thank you for that. And thank you for these resources. I'm looking for it because I want the journal for sure. Um, and
I would
I
love
really
your
want that.
feedback.
Yes, and I want the calligraphy one as soon as it comes out too. So this is exciting, and I'll make sure that all that information is in the description of the podcast. That way it's available to all of our listeners, and we'll share this as well. So Mila, where can everyone find you?
Well, for now, just aesthetic femininity on Instagram, and then think pretty thoughts on Instagram as well. I have misplaced like my login information for that account, and so that's why there's been like nothing for me for a while because I'm like, I don't remember what password I'm supposed to put in for this one. And so yeah, so those are the two places that people can find me. Obviously, Amazon, will provide links for the resources there, but um, maybe one day I'll do a YouTube channel. I'm not really sure. Right now, I'm just kind of trying to be good at being a housewife and, things like that. I've never been very good at it. So it's sort of a learning process.
You are amazing, and everyone needs to go follow her at Aesthetic Femininity. Like I said, I've learned so much from her Instagram account. And like I'm looking at it right now, actually, and just some of the icons and stuff that you've shared too. Like I personally love seeing icons just everywhere because they just bring me peace looking at them. But no, I've learned so much from you. I know our listeners have, and I just thank you so much for being on this today, Mila, and look forward to connecting with you again soon.
Thank you so much.
You've just listened to another episode of the Myrrh Bearing Millennial Podcast. Thanks so much for joining in this week. And again, if you loved what you listened to today, please rate and share the episode to help the podcast get discovered. And I'm so excited to see you next week on Wednesday again for another episode of the Myrrh Bearing Millennial Podcast. See you then.